May of 1977, Benton County, Arkansas. The air was thick with the pollen of oak and hickory, a fine yellowed dust that settled on every surface, on the hoods of pickup trucks, on the shoulders of denim jackets, on the still, humid air itself. It was the time of year when the world turned green with a fierce, almost violent explosion of life. A time for planting, for planning, for looking ahead to the long, hot stretch of summer. A time for decisions that would determine the fate of a farm, the difference between profit and loss, between holding on and selling out. Eleanor Vance was 68 years old. She was a widow. Her husband, John, had been gone for 3 years, a loss that had settled into the county's perception of her like the fine yellow dust, a permanent feature of her landscape. She lived on the 80 acres they had bought together, a plot of land off a gravel road between Gentry and Decatur. It was not prime land. It was rocky, rolling Ozark hill country, better suited to scrub oak and cedar than to the neat, profitable rows of soybeans or corn that filled the flatter lands to the east. On the third Tuesday of May, Eleanor Vance drove her truck to the livestock auction barn just outside of Gravette. It was a 1965 Ford F-100, the paint a faded seafoam green, chipped and scoured by years of work. A line of rust, dark as dried blood, traced the lower edge of the driver's side door. The engine turned over with a slow, grinding complaint, but it always caught. It was a machine she understood. It was a machine that had never failed her. The auction was a weekly ritual for the men of the county, a place to trade cattle, to buy a sow, to sell off a litter of pups. It was a place of business, but it was also a social institution, a clearinghouse for news, for gossip, for the reinforcement of community standards. The air inside the main barn was a heavy cocktail of scents: manure, sawdust, chewing tobacco, diesel exhaust, and the faint metallic tang of anxiety from the animals penned in the back. Eleanor Vance did not go to the main barn. She went to the poultry shed, a long, low-slung outbuilding with a tin roof and open sides covered in chicken wire. This was the less prestigious corner of the auction, the place for small-time operators, for hobbyists, for those selling off a few dozen laying hens or a clutch of broiler chicks. The auctioneer here was a fast-talking man named Clyde, who could work his way through 100 lots in an hour, his voice a rhythmic, hypnotic patter that rarely paused for breath. She stood at the back, a small, still figure in a plain cotton dress and sturdy work boots. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her face unreadable. She watched as lots of healthy, vibrant pullets were sold, Rhode Island reds, their feathers a deep, glossy auburn, barred rocks with their crisp black and white stripes, white leghorns, bred for their prolific egg production. They sold for $1.50, $1.75, sometimes $2 a bird for a prime lot. The men bidding were confident, their gestures sharp, their voices clear. They knew what they were buying. They were buying potential. They were buying the promise of eggs, the promise of profit. Eleanor waited. She waited until the end of the sale, when the crowd had thinned and Clyde the auctioneer was looking to clear the last of the lots. This was when the cull birds were brought out, the undesirables, the leftovers from large commercial operations, birds that had failed to meet the strict standards of modern poultry production. A set of stacked metal cages was rolled to the front. They were packed tight with hens that looked nothing like the prime specimens sold earlier. These were Rhode Island reds, but their color was dull, dusty. Their feathers were broken, missing in patches, revealing pale, pimpled skin. Some were feather-pecked raw around their vents. Their combs, which should have been a vibrant, waxy red, were pale pink and shrunken. Their eyes were cloudy, listless. They huddled together, not with the busy, clucking energy of a healthy flock, but with the exhausted stillness of profound sickness. Clyde the auctioneer did not waste time on a sales pitch. He pointed a finger at the cages. "Lot 314, he called out, his voice tired. 400 head, give or take. Commercial culls. As is, where is. What am I bid for the lot? Somebody give me $50 to start. $50 for the whole shebang." Silence. The few remaining men in the shed looked at the cages, then looked away. One spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the dirt floor. Another shook his head, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of dismissal. $50 was an insultingly low price, but even that was too much. This was not a flock. This was a vector for disease. This was 400 problems in a cage. Bringing these birds onto your land was like deliberately seeding your fields with thistle and Johnson grass. It was agricultural suicide. "All right, $40, Clyde said, his voice flat. $40 to haul 'em away. Cheaper than a rendering truck. $40, anyone?" From the back of the shed, a single hand was raised. Eleanor Vance's hand. Clyde squinted, then a flicker of surprise crossed his face, quickly replaced by professional indifference. $40 from the lady in the back. Sold. To Mrs. Vance for $40. He banged his gavel, a sharp, final crack that echoed in the near-empty shed. The transaction was swift. $40 in cash, counted out from a small, worn leather purse. 4 $10 bills. A receipt was scribbled on a carbon copy pad. The men who remained watched her, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They watched as she backed her old Ford truck up to the loading dock. They watched as two auction hands, their faces wrinkled in distaste, loaded the heavy cages onto the truck bed. The cages rattled and shook, and a cloud of feather dust and dander filled the air. The men of the county had one word for it: grief. It was the only explanation that made sense. John Vance's passing had finally broken something in her. She was a 68-year-old widow, alone on that rocky farm, and her mind had come undone. The purchase was not a business decision. It was an act of madness, a cry for help written in the language of sick chickens. The story traveled faster than the old Ford truck could carry the hens home. It spread from the auction barn to the feed co-op in Gravett, where farmers gathered on Saturday mornings. It was discussed over coffee and pie at the Ozark Cafe in Decatur, the town's central hub of information. It was whispered about in the church parking lot after Sunday service in Gentry. Eleanor Vance bought the cull flock, the sick ones, 400 of them. The laughter was not loud or malicious. It was quiet, sad, knowing. It was the laughter of men who understood the unforgiving logic of farming, the thin margin between success and failure. They laughed the way you laugh at a child's impossible idea, with a sense of weary wisdom. They felt sorry for her. They pitied her. They were certain of her failure. This certainty was built on a foundation of hard-won knowledge. The poultry industry in Benton County was not a hobby. It was a science, a massive economic engine that had transformed the region. Companies like Tyson and Peterson Farms had perfected a system of production that relied on uniformity, biosecurity, and ruthless efficiency. The conventional wisdom was clear. You started with healthy chicks from a certified hatchery, chicks that had been vaccinated for Marek's disease, for coccidiosis, for Newcastle disease. You raised them in a clean environment, on a carefully formulated diet of protein, vitamins, and minerals. You measured their feed conversion ratios. You monitored their weight gain. You protected your flock from any and all outside contamination. A farmer's boots were to be dipped in disinfectant before entering a chicken house. Wild birds were to be kept away. Rodents were to be eradicated. A sick bird was not to be coddled. It was to be culled immediately to protect the rest of the flock. An entire flock showing signs of illness, like the one Eleanor had purchased, was a biohazard. It was a financial liability of the highest order. Those 400 hens were a Pandora's box of poultry diseases. They almost certainly carried infectious coryza, fowl cholera, avian influenza in some low-grade form. They were crawling with external parasites, mites, lice. Their immune systems were compromised from the stress of overcrowding and poor nutrition in their previous life. To bring them onto a piece of land was to contaminate the very soil. The pathogens they carried could persist for years, making it impossible to raise a healthy flock there in the future. What Eleanor Vance had done was not just foolish, it was irresponsible. It was a threat not just to her own property, but to the neighboring farms. Disease did not respect property lines. It traveled on the wind, on the feet of birds, in the droppings of predators. The men at the co-op talked about it in low tones. They hoped she would come to her senses and call the rendering plant herself. It was the only sane thing to do. Cut your losses. $40 was a cheap lesson. But Eleanor did not call the rendering plant. She drove the 12 miles back to her farm, the old truck groaning under the weight of the cages. She turned off the county blacktop onto her gravel drive, a quarter-mile lane lined with Osage orange trees. She parked the truck not near her main coop, the one John had built, but next to a fallow pasture at the far eastern edge of her property, a quarantine zone. For the next 4 years, Eleanor Vance became a ghost in her own community. She was seen, but not engaged with. They saw her truck at the feed store, where she bought 50-pound bags of scratch grains, of laying mash, of oyster shell grit. But she also bought things that made the clerks scratch their heads. Huge sacks of diatomaceous earth, jugs of raw, unfiltered apple cider vinegar, bags of dried garlic powder and oregano. She was polite but distant. She did her business and left. The men would nod to her, a gesture of strained courtesy, but the easy chatter would stop until her truck was back on the road. On her farm, she worked with a quiet, relentless purpose. The first task was triage. She and John had built a small secondary coop years ago for isolating broody hens. It had 4 separate pens. She used it as an infirmary. With gloved hands, she inspected every single one of the 400 hens. Her movements were slow, deliberate, her eyes missing nothing. She looked at their feet, checking for the telltale crust of scaly leg mites. She looked at the base of their feathers for the tiny crawling specks of lice. She checked their breathing for the rattling sound of respiratory infection. She assessed their weight, the sharpness of their keel bones. Out of the 400, 67 were too far gone. Their bodies were skeletal, their breathing labored, their eyes completely dull. They showed no interest in food or water. With a heavy heart but a steady hand, she culled them. It was a necessary mercy, a grim but essential part of animal husbandry that the men at the auction would have understood, had they known. She buried them deep, liming the pit before covering it with earth. That left 333. She moved them from the cramped transport cages into a large temporary enclosure she had built. It was a simple affair of T-posts and chicken wire, but it was spacious. 10,000 square feet of pasture that had been left fallow for 2 years. The grass was knee-high. It was full of insects, of seeds, of life. For hens that had likely spent their entire existence in a crowded, sterile building, it was a world of bewildering novelty. Her treatment plan was not from any veterinary textbook of the era. It was older knowledge, a blend of folk wisdom and keen observation passed down through generations of farm women who had raised poultry with limited resources. She added the raw apple cider vinegar to their waterers, a tablespoon per gallon. It was for their digestion, to alter the pH of their gut, making it less hospitable to internal parasites. She mixed the garlic powder and oregano into their feed, a mash she made herself by soaking the commercial pellets in warm water to make them easier to eat for the weaker birds. These were natural antibiotics, immune boosters. The diatomaceous earth was for the external parasites. She filled shallow wooden boxes with the fine, white powder. It was a dust bath. The hens, driven by instinct, would flutter and roll in it, coating their feathers and skin. The microscopic, razor-sharp edges of the fossilized diatoms would desiccate the waxy exoskeletons of mites and lice, killing them without chemicals. For the first month, it was a constant battle. She lost another 41 birds. They would seem to be improving one day, only to be found dead under a cedar tree the next morning. She continued her grim routine of culling and burying. Each loss was a small failure, but she did not waver. She was not trying to save every bird. She was trying to save the flock. She was selecting for resilience. Slowly, painstakingly, a change began. The remaining 292 hens started to transform. New feathers began to grow in, covering the bare patches of skin. The new feathers were glossier, deeper in color. Their combs and wattles began to regain their color, shifting from pale pink to a healthy, robust red. Their eyes cleared. The listlessness was replaced by a cautious curiosity. They began to forage. At first they were hesitant, unsure of the strange green stuff under their feet. But soon, instinct took over. They scratched at the soil, unearthing worms and grubs. They chased grasshoppers. They stripped the seeds from heads of foxtail and crabgrass. They were supplementing their diet, balancing their own nutritional needs in a way no formulated feed ever could. They were becoming chickens again. By the end of the first summer, the flock was stable. They were still thin, still bearing the marks of their past trauma, but they were survivors. They had a pecking order. They had a routine. They would range across the pasture during the day and return to the safety of the simple A-frame roosts she had built for them at night. The first egg appeared in early September. It was small, pale, and thin-shelled, but it was a sign, a promise. Eleanor found it in a nest of flattened grass under a sumac bush. She held it in her palm, a perfect, fragile symbol of recovery. Within a week, there were a dozen eggs a day, then 50, then 100. The men at the co-op were wrong. The farm was not contaminated. The soil was not poisoned. In fact, the opposite was happening. The chickens, in their constant foraging, were fertilizing the pasture. Their droppings returned nitrogen to the soil. Their scratching aerated it. The pasture, which had been a tangle of weeds, was becoming a managed landscape, the grass shorter, healthier. Over the next 3 years, Eleanor's flock became a closed system. She did not bring in any new birds. She hatched her own replacement stock from the best of her hens, selecting for the ones that were the most vigorous foragers, the most attentive mothers, the most resistant to the minor ailments that occasionally swept through. She was not breeding for conformity, for the uniform perfection demanded by the commercial industry. She was breeding for hardiness, for intelligence, for survival. She sold the eggs at a small stand at the end of her driveway, a simple wooden table with a hand-painted sign. Farm eggs, $1 a dozen. An old coffee can served as the honor system cash box. The yolks of her eggs were a deep, vibrant orange, a stark contrast to the pale yellow yolks of the supermarket eggs. People noticed. The local doctors, the school teachers, the bank manager's wife. They started making the drive down her gravel road. The coffee can was always full of dollars and quarters by the end of the day. The community's view of her began to shift, subtly. The pity was replaced by a kind of grudging respect. She was still eccentric old Mrs. Vance, but she was no longer seen as mad. She was just different. Her methods were strange, old-fashioned, but they seemed to work for her. The men at the co-op would see her loading her feed bags and might comment, "Those hens still laying for you, Eleanor?" And she would nod and say, "They are." And that would be the end of it. They still didn't understand her decision, but they could not argue with the evidence of a full coffee can. Then came the summer of 1981, 4 years after she bought the sick hens. It was a summer of biblical plagues. First, a drought settled over the Ozarks in late June. The sky turned a hazy, metallic white. The pastures turned brown and brittle. Ponds shrank, their edges cracking into patterns like broken pottery. The air was still, heavy and hot. Day after day, the temperature climbed over 100 degrees. With the heat and the drought came the insects. Grasshoppers swarmed in clouds, and worse, the ticks. It was a new kind of tick, or an old kind with a new virulence. The Lone Star tick, Amblyomma americanum, was common to the region, but this year it was different. The population exploded. They were everywhere, a crawling, questing menace in the dead grass. And they carried a disease, a protozoan blood parasite that was devastating to poultry. They called it fowl tick fever. The extension agents from the University of Arkansas had never seen an outbreak like it. The symptoms were swift and brutal. A healthy-looking hen would suddenly become lethargic. Her legs would grow weak, leading to paralysis. She would stop eating and drinking. A high fever would set in. Within 48 hours, she would be dead, her blood thinned by the parasite, her body anemic and wasted. It swept through Benton County like a fire. The large commercial broiler houses, with their thousands of birds packed together, were hit first. Despite their biosecurity protocols, the ticks found a way in, likely on rodents or wild birds. A single tick could infect a bird, and then mites and lice, common even in the cleanest houses, would spread the parasite from bird to bird with horrifying speed. Entire houses of 10,000 chickens were wiped out in a week. The companies lost millions. The smaller, independent farmers were hit just as hard. The men who had laughed in the auction shed 4 years earlier were now walking their fields in a state of shock, collecting the bodies of their prized hens from the dust. Their flocks of 50, of 100, of 200 birds were decimated. They tried everything. They sprayed their coops with creosote. They dusted their birds with the newest chemical pesticides from the co-op, powerful organophosphates that were dangerous to handle and of questionable effectiveness. Nothing worked. The ticks were relentless. The disease was unstoppable. The county was in a state of panic. It was the only topic of conversation. The price of eggs tripled, but there were few to sell. The poultry industry, the lifeblood of the local economy, was facing a catastrophe. 2 inspectors from the university's agriculture department were sent to survey the damage and collect data. Their names were Dr. Mills and a young graduate student named Ben. They drove from farm to farm in a state-owned Chevrolet sedan, their faces grim. The story was the same everywhere. Dead birds, sick birds, desperate farmers. They documented mortality rates of 70, 80, even 90%. Their survey route eventually took them down the gravel road to Eleanor Vance's farm. They were not expecting to find anything different. Her name was on their list, a small operator with a flock of a few hundred birds. They pulled up her drive and saw her egg stand. It was piled high with full cartons of brown eggs. The coffee can was overflowing. It was the first sign that something here was unusual. They found Eleanor in the pasture with her flock. The sight that greeted them was so profoundly different from everything else they had seen that for a moment they were speechless. The drought had hit her land, too. The oak trees were wilting. The grass in the ungrazed parts of her property was brown. But the pasture where her chickens roamed was still green. It was grazed short, but it was green. And the chickens themselves were a picture of impossible health. There were nearly 300 of them, a vibrant, multi-generational flock of deep auburn hens and proud, watchful roosters. They were not just alive, they were thriving. They were scratching, foraging, dust-bathing. Their feathers shone in the harsh sunlight. Their combs were a startling, vivid red. There was not a single sick or lethargic bird among them. Dr. Mills, a man with 30 years of experience in avian pathology, took off his hat and wiped his brow. He looked at the chickens, then at the pasture, then at Eleanor. He asked her what she was doing, what chemicals she was using, what secret she had. Eleanor simply shook her head. She used no chemicals. She had no secret. Ben, the graduate student, was methodical. He started with the basics. He knelt down and ran his hands through the short grass. He searched the soil. He expected to find a carpet of ticks. He found none. He then asked for permission to inspect some of the birds. Eleanor nodded and, with a practiced ease, caught a large, calm hen. Ben examined the bird thoroughly. He parted the feathers, looking for ticks around the vent, under the wings, on the head. He found nothing. No ticks, no mites, no lice. The hen was perfectly clean. Her skin was healthy. Her weight was good. He drew a small blood sample from a vein in her wing. He did this with 10 different birds. Back at the lab in Fayetteville, the results were baffling. The blood samples showed no sign of the parasite, but they did show